All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. We are week number 9. We are getting to the end of the term. And I think a really valuable, really important article for this week called Rise of the Carceral State or the Prison State System of Incarceration, and applying some concepts and theories to it. So the purpose of this video is to give you a little bit of background information to the article, and some good food for thought, some concepts and theories from the class that we can apply when we're thinking about or reviewing this particular article. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. So remember, if you could recall back, I can't remember, it's like maybe week 2, week 3, Ferdinand Tönnies and Emil Durkheim talking about, it was the chapter on, or the week on, social control. We had formal social control, institutions, like the incarceration system is a formal system of social control. I mean, employment sectors, yeah, healthcare can be a system of control. Any formal institutional level control. There's formal, there's informal control coming from groups, people that we know, our community. It's more informal control. And then you get into ideological control, which control of beliefs, and kind of getting into that social construction of reality a little bit. That through shaping our beliefs, control the way that people influence the way people think, that can have an influence on what people do. So it's an instrument of control. So anyway, going back to Tönnies and Durkheim, so Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, and organic and mechanical solidarity for Durkheim. Basically, they're after the similar thing, and that's this shift from more communal ways of life, Gemeinschaft, agrarian, feudal Europe, smaller populations, more into high levels of integration of people within the community, less hierarchy, less stratification, all that kind of stuff. And then you get into Gesellschaft and mechanical solidarity, you get industrial capitalism. And I think this becomes important to think about the carceral state, is that the prison system emerges in the United States. The United States becomes the model around the world, the developing world, of building a mass prison system, or building prisons. Now, people have been incarcerated, people have been shackled and put in dungeons and put in prison, so to speak, for long periods of human history. But prison as an institution, architecture, design, as a formal institution did not arise until 1800s in the United States. I can't remember Eastern State Penitentiary when that opened up. So one thing to consider when you're looking at this article, the historical development, if we go back before industrial capitalism, we didn't have these formal systems of control. If we're looking at things from a functionalist viewpoint, we see that, well, what happened is that societies went from a communal way of life, agrarian, to capitalism, urbanism, higher concentration of number of people, greater stratification, increased economic divide between the top and the bottom, more anonymity living in an urban environment. People have broken social ties from their extended family and their community. So we got a rising problem in development of crime within communities. And from a functionalist viewpoint, is that we got this kind of dysfunction going on. Safety and security of people and community becomes a challenge. Therefore, society figures out a way to respond to this crisis or this problem, and the development of the criminal justice system, of law enforcement, and then prison starts to develop. Actually, prisons develop first before law enforcement. So society is this problem-solving entity. So institutions emerge to take care of human problems. So Durkheim, he's our functionalist theorist, or one of them, but a foundational functionalist theorist, focused a lot on issues of integrating, the importance that people are integrated into society in a healthy way, and that their behavior is regulated in a healthy way. Systems that are problematic, that don't work well, is when there's an under-regulation or over-regulation. People, either there's not significant enough regulation of human behavior, people are allowed too much freedom, and that creates problems for the social order. And on the other side, if it's too much regulation, that's a problem as well. And for a functionalist viewpoint, if there's problems with the system that's there, it's working to make it better through making gradual reforms. So with mass incarceration that started in the 1980s during the war on drugs, led to all kinds of different problems and issues in terms of mass incarceration. And then we provide these reform measures to address some of those problems. It's very functionalist viewpoint, very counter to a viewpoint coming from the conflict theory perspective. Now, there's limitations of this theory, the functionalist viewpoint, that it's not addressing issues of power, inequality, interest, political interest, and things like that. What you're going to get into in the article a little bit is that each time there's been a wave of prison development or a new era of prison development, there's always political and economic things going on. So I don't think we can divorce or remove from our analysis the political and economic factors that influence the development of a prison system. Conflict theory is going to focus more on that the system itself, whether that's prison or criminal justice system or healthcare or education, whatever it might be, that these institutions reflect and reinforce very particular interests and inequalities. That this is a system of control, the prison system is, but not only a system of control of just all of us, but it impacts certain populations and demographics more than others. And also, it's a system of control not only of individuals, but it establishes the authority of the state. It provides a framework or an ideology, a belief about the reason people are kind of bad, they need to be controlled, versus addressing kind of upriver, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in prison abolition, rather than addressing, well, what's going on that's creating these problems. We focus on incarceration. Well, whose interests are served by incarceration versus addressing the conditions out of which this behavior comes. And then there's the rise in the development of the prison industrial complex. Conflict theory is going to be much more critical that this institution or this rise in development is actually making us more safe and secure. It's going to address that there's a lot of either racism, sexism, things that are going on in this particular space that's influencing the development of a prison industrial complex. And things like, getting tough on crime is a political stance, like a moral panic around things. Think about just like moral panics, right? Of how politicians could use sort of language of getting tough on crime in order to facilitate some political goal. Then we can get into interactionism, or more micro level theory, and think about, well, how do we understand crime? How do we understand deviance? How do we understand how do we think about individuals who are incarcerated? What about individuals who are incarcerated in their self-identity and development? Like, these are all areas of interest for an interactionist. Kind of recall in this space that nothing exists without any inherent meaning. Humans give things meaning. We construct reality. This perspective is going to be interested in how we develop meaning and what those meanings are. We base our responses or our behavior, our ways of thinking, are a reflection of our meanings. So we get to look at symbolic interactionism. Nothing has an inherent meaning. How do we come to understand things? And we base our responses based on those meanings. And we also get into our own identities. We can also think about, like, within a prison subculture, right? Prisons are subcultures. They have their own language, institutional structures, very unique, set apart from society itself. And what happens in terms, what's the influence of that subculture on people's identity? What's the language within that subculture? What is the structure of that subculture in the interaction between guards and individuals who are in custody? Like how do we think about sort of that institution and its impact on everyone who's within that institution? We get into social construction of reality for sure. Think about, we develop these ideas that somebody offended the social body, somebody broke a rule or law, and we have, as a culture, do we look at things through a sense of retribution, eye for an eye, for a tooth, coming out of very religious kind of ideals, or rehabilitation, that we're actually trying to rehabilitate the individual and facilitate them returning back into society. This is, from a constructionist perspective, this is not like what, whichever side a nation decides to favor, or what combination. That is a lot of culture and history. There's no one way of doing it. There's a lot of ways of doing it that have different outcomes. I think things like getting tough on crime at certain time periods is definitely a retribution model versus rehabilitation. So what's going on that's leading to a particular construction about who the inmates are and who we are as a community, and how do we see this resolve. We could also get into things like stigma, labeling theory, Think about the ways that society reacts to the person who is offended, and that reaction can actually facilitate additional criminal or deviant behavior. So we're looking at the amplification sometimes of deviance based on the labeling process itself. So think about certain labels like convict, felon, inmate, and now more common language, adults in custody or an adult in custody to decrease the stigma. People are still being held accountable for their actions by serving time for being in, serving time that's required by the courts, but being aware that language that stigma could be counterproductive to rehabilitation and reintegrating people within society itself. And then some other additional ideas, things to think about: positivism and constructionism. I think if we look at this criminal, like the prison system, the carceral state, that some of the ideologies and beliefs and things that were going on, and we could say it came out of science, came out of social sciences. That we look back now, scientific racism, sexism, classism facilitated the development of the carceral system. I think about more recent policies, like there was a policy called the broken windows policies, which the researchers, social psychologists who came up with this idea uh, originally came up with this idea that, okay, to simplify the idea is that in a community, if there's a broken window, you don't fix the broken window, then pretty soon people will feel like in the community that things aren't being taken care of. Therefore, there goes the neighborhood. That's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. The researchers who came up with this idea were later on, one of the researchers was horrified how law enforcement departments and policies within police departments took this. And rather than trying to work to build the community, the law enforcement response was actually further creating further problems by dividing and incarcerating and taking that sort of retribution model versus community development model. And then in policies like stand and frisk, giving law enforcement the opportunity if an officer believes that somebody could be a suspect or be potentially a person who commits a crime, that stop and frisk. They can stop them and frisk the person. And later on became through the courts and it was deemed through the courts as unconstitutional, that there was discriminatory aspects to this. So I think, I just want to sort of provide a perspective. We can go back into our theories of positivism, constructionism, that we've got to be mindful that some theories of criminology actually were coming from a space, either coming from or reinforcing a space of racial or class inequality. I don't know. I thought about incorporating too, like social disorganization theory, that we can think about one of our early theories of crime in sociology that is very empathetic view, that looking at if there's crime going on in a particular area and we look at concentrations of crime, it's a reflection of some disorganization going on in that community where there's a lack of sense of community, of stability within that community. And out of that circumstance, increased rates of crime are likely to happen. So we have a choice to make if that's the case, and that's to invest in these communities to help build them, or to engage in incarceration. Or maybe it's going to be some combination of the two. But I think if we look at the rise of the carceral state, we put a lot of focus on the development of the prison system and maybe less so in the development of community development. We get into Lombroso's theories of biological theories, these scientific racism and classism for sure operating here, searching for, communities or nations were searching for answers of why people were doing criminal things. And these biological theories became pretty powerful explanations, even though they're empirically invalid. You go to the moral panics, wars on drugs, 70s and 80s, a lot of moral entrepreneurs. The functionalist perspective is like, man, what's going on in society at that time that people were prone to accepting this moral panic that led to mass incarceration? The number of people in prison across time was, 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then it was like 1980s. I mean, if you look at a chart, and that's largely as a result of the war on drugs, and a moral panic. Conflict theory view of the moral panic is that this is serving class interest and there's racial inequities that are built within it. So yeah, while maybe there was it resonated with the public at that particular moment in time, it also is reflective of ideals coming out of white supremacy and racism and classism. So just a few different additional perspectives, and then then I'll just give you a really brief overview of the reading. That if you're interested in this stuff, I think a fascinating book to read is Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison by Michel Foucault, a French theorist who writes a lot about the kind of transition from Enlightenment to kind of like modern world, so modernity. If we go back to Tannis or Durkheim from before, he is like what Foucault is interested in is that this transition that happens, and his argument is that um, his argument or a perspective that he offers is that we have a different system of control. Control operated before in those early, more communal agrarian societies, more contemporary societies, modern societies. We have different instruments of control. They seem nicer and kinder and more humane, but they're actually more thorough into punishment of the body and punishment of the soul. And he talks a lot about the disciplines, the academic disciplines, and implicates the academic disciplines for trying, this approach that academics have trying to reform the individual versus letting the person serve their time for punishment, not trying to reform them. He kind of unpacks this kind of story about how do we get to the birth of the prisons. And this is an idea of the panopticon. So the panopticon of one eye. And it's a very efficient design. This is a Eastern State Penitentiary model. I had an opportunity to visit that penitentiary. It's a historical landmark now. If you're ever in Philadelphia, go check it out. And it's really fascinating, this idea that this building, this institution like that, and with this idea that you have the central guard tower who can see everybody, but no one knows if they're being watched. It's an efficient way of control. Incarcerated Nations is a book that's really interesting about her journey in different countries of looking at their prison systems. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, the Age of Colorblindness. It's 15 years old almost now. And then the film The 13th, looking at in the United States, the history of criminal justice policies going back to the 13th Amendment. And then the works of Angela Davis, a prison abolitionist who's done a lot of work over the years. I think there's some misunderstanding of prison abolition of what that means. And I just wanted to sort of identify, and this could be related to the article too, when you're reading it, is, if we could focus on the development of the prison system without addressing the conditions which are causing people to do things that are harmful to others and create problems in our communities, we are potentially contributing to a larger problem. And prison abolition is focused on, at least one part of prison abolition work is, let's address the original root of the problem and the structure and the conditions to decrease or remove the need for prisons. So it's not like all of a sudden a prison abolitionist is not like, okay, let's just close all prisons and then release everyone. I mean, it's more about, let's address the underlying roots of the problem. Let's focus upstream and then address the conditions out of which certain types of crime happen. And then also be aware that prisons are reflecting a lot of inequalities. Those who end up there oftentimes don't have the most resources to be able to do that. So the rise of the carceral state, Jonathan Simon, I read this years ago. I was like, man, this is a great historical piece on the development of our prison system. And it goes through different time periods in the prison building eras. I hope you find it fascinating, interesting, and informative. When I read it, I was on a trip through the United States, cross-country trip, and I stopped by Folsom Prison in California just to kind of to get a little bit of perspective and information about that particular prison and its historical importance. And one thing I was fascinated by is that, and it fit right into this article, is that California, at the time when Folsom Prison was built, California, their prison capacity was getting short. They wanted to build more prisons. They didn't have a lot of money, resources. Person owned a lot of land. This is also near the Folsom Dam, feeding into a river that goes into Sacramento. And there became a deal between the person who owned the land and the state. And the deal was, hey, I'll give you this land so you can build your prison so the land's free. In exchange, that you provide me or provide us the labor of the inmates in order to build the dam so we can have hydroelectricity. So there's an interest going on here. And as you read the article, Carceral State, there's a certain age of prison development that gets into this sort of like these kind of issues, and this was somewhat common at that time. The goal of the reading is to just basically get a better understanding about the history of prisons in the United States, look at the political, economic influences of carceral systems, and break away from an idea that prisons were formed just to take care of problems in our communities. There's always been a political nature to it. I think it's important to recognize that political nature so that we can be more empowered in terms of making decisions about how to address infractions from our members of our communities. All right, that is it. Enjoy the reading. And yeah, here's to week 9. Take care.